there, Cape Cod. It's a little past high noon on Wednesday today, but we're here with the latest episode of Life with Gwenn. You are probably all getting ready for your cookouts for July 4th, and that's a great thing to do, but it's also a good time to think about the holiday and what it means. And it means a lot more here in Barnstable County than you may have heard. So we have with us today Phineas Fisk, who is a board member of Tales of Cape Cod, and they own the courthouse, the old courthouse on Route 6A in Barnstable Village. And this is a place that actually is a very good start for our story. Welcome, Phineas.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Tell me a little bit about how it is that the courthouses are at the center of what was happening outside of Boston in the counties.
The courthouses around the colony of Massachusetts represented the royal governor's interests. The royal governor defined what happened in many ways by what happened at the courthouse. Local affairs were the matter of the town meeting.
Okay.
And our courthouse, as it turned out, was the place where Cape Cod told the British that it had no intention of listening to the new rules that the British were seeking to impose on Massachusetts in 1774, leading essentially to the independence of Cape Cod and eventually the rest of the colony from the British year and a half before the nation, or the yet-to-be nation, declared independence in Philadelphia in 1776.
I read or watched in one of the histories that you referred me to that C.M. Adams was actually sending messages back to Barnstable County and other counties saying, slow down guys, we're not ready yet. We still have to work things out. But it was here in Barnstable County, it was a bloodless revolution. Tell me the day-to-day part of how it happened.
It was absolutely bloodless. It was the court session was scheduled for September 27 that year, which was a Tuesday. The day before, a group of Cape Codders and a few people from off Cape assembled in Sandwich, about 12 miles west of Barnstable, and organized the protest in an orderly way, electing their leaders and choosing among themselves the rules that they were to follow. So it was an extremely orderly event that followed on the next day. The next day, Tuesday, the group marched the 12 miles from Sandwich to Barnstable.
Little jaunts in those days.
Anyway, that took 6 hours or something like that. When they got to the courthouse, they blocked access to the judges who were arriving to begin the court session that fall, and demanded that the judges ignore the new rules that the British were seeking to impose on the Cape and the rest of Massachusetts, eliminating most of the democratic institutions that had developed over the previous 80-something years.
Like, could you give me an example of one of those institutions?
The most basic one was town meetings.
Oh, okay.
Town meetings could bring up any subject, could be called at any time. When the British realized that there was an awful lot of democracy going on here, they'd ruled in the Massachusetts Government Act that there could be one town meeting a year to organize and elect representatives to the council, the governor's council, and that's all.
Wow. So that would have really gutted the system. And I can, it makes sense to me that Cape Codders would say, nope, not doing that. An independent lot that was used to, taking their living from the land and the sea and said, no, that's not going to work for me.
Exactly.
So now it's interesting because last year on September 27th, 2018, some of you got together for a lecture and also to do something pretty special. Tell me about that.
We were very pleased at Tales of Cape Cod, which was encouraging the county, Barnstable County, to recognize the fact that in 1774, independence was achieved right here in front of the courthouse, 8 miles from here. And it turned out that the president of the Board of Commissioners understood, when we talked to him,
Present day.
Present day, right, yes. Understood the importance of what had occurred and agreed that the commissioners would reproduce on the anniversary day the event that had happened 200 and something years before.
And where were you gathered? Because I saw people signing with quills.
Yeah.
Yes. Where had you gathered for that? Was it in the courthouse?
In the courthouse.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a historian actually came from California for the event, who was deeply involved in writing about the American Revolution.
Mr. Raphael?
Ray Raphael. To help to emphasize the significance of what had happened here.
And I saw several people in tri-corner hats, and now if you and I, this is just kind of a little side thing, but I found it interesting. It's Forgotten Drinks of Colonial New England.
Mm-hmm.
So we were saying that if you and I were talking about this, we might be each having a blackberry shrub, which is one of the drinks that they sort of recreate in both a modern and an original version here. And you were saying that where would we be? We'd be talking where?
We would probably be, if we were back then, in the Crocker Tavern, which is across the street from the courthouse. It was where the Patriots tended to gather. There were other taverns nearby, but some of them are Loyalist taverns. The Crocker Tavern was the one where the opponents of the new rules would meet.
And I have to ask, were there women, going to those Patriots meetings?
I'm afraid not. This was a male-dominated society, and women were expected not to take part.
Well, I guess, but it's interesting because when I watched the series on the Adams, it certainly looked like she was a huge influence on all of his policy.
Absolutely, yes.
So
yes.
they took part, they just took part at home.
Right.
Where
Exactly.
sometimes you feel like it's still that way.
Right.
But so not in the tavern, though. We wouldn't be sharing a shrub in the tavern.
Actually, in the tavern is where the judges who had been barred from the courthouse met, assembled. They had to go somewhere. So they gathered there and decided to have lunch. And it is there that the protesters presented them their demands that the judges forswear any allegiance to the British as long as the British were trying to impose the new anti-democratic rules on the Cape and all of Massachusetts. And it is there the judges agreed.
So when you go to town meeting, and I know that there's at least one special town meeting coming up that in today's paper I saw it, but when you go to town meeting, it's because of what happened on September 27th, 1774. And this is why I always had trouble with history. It's the dates. I love the stories when you hear exactly who did what, that kind of thing. But so that's why you can go to town meeting and cast your vote, one man, one vote, or some towns have, of course, gone to a elected representatives system. But either way, that all comes out of Barnstable saying to England, no, we're not doing that.
That had been traditionally the way things were done before the British came along with their new rules. And Cape Cod simply said, no, we're not going to pay attention to your new rules. And after the rules went into effect, the Barnstable town had town meetings, 2 or 3 town meetings after the new rules went into effect. Just ignored them.
So what happened to judges who were, I mean, they were hearing legal cases, right?
Yes.
So did they go back to doing it the way they had been doing it?
The judges, yes, essentially went back to the way they had been doing it. The way things worked before had been just fine. The British said, we're going to change that. The judges did cancel the meeting, the court session that was scheduled for that day, but they continued quietly and in some cases elsewhere, not in the courthouse.
Ah, interesting.
To
I was wondering
perform
about
their
that.
duties.
When you it's interesting because I know things took forever. You know, it took 6 hours to get to the protest that they were having. You know, because you went by foot. But what did England send a response?
When the British heard that what was going on, they ordered the colonial governor, General Gage, Thomas Gage, to do something about it. He had so few troops that he knew with all of Massachusetts in rebellion, there was nothing he could do. But the British pestered him a little more about this. And as a result, he sent out an expedition in April of the next year.
The governor did.
The governor did, on April 19th, to reclaim or to claim the munitions that the rebels had stored in Concord. When they got there, there were no munitions. They'd all been hidden. And the confrontation resulted in a battle, and the battle became what is known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And when the news reached the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, it organized the Continental Army and appointed George Washington to be its general. So that moment was the start of the war, even though the revolution, political revolution, had actually happened in 74.
It's interesting because the Tea Party and the Battle of Lexington and Concord, these are things that we learn in school, and they're well known and they're labeled as landmarks, and they were, but they were landmarks that came, almost 2 years after Barnstable County said, we are going to have democratic rule.
Ray Raphael, who is the historian who was here for the event.
Yeah, over 20 books. He's really an interesting guy.
Yes. Points out that when you read about history, what you read about is wars, battles, famous people, sort of bloodshed and mayhem. All this happened, what happened in Barnstable on September 27 and 74 happened without any of those things. There were no famous leaders. There was no bloodshed. There was no gunfire. Because it was so well controlled, it got no attention from the historians later on. They wanted to see something exciting happen.
And it was more like a democratic meeting.
It was like a democratic meeting. Yeah.
Although I read that in Plymouth, the protesters at the courthouse there were so inspired by their quiet protests that they decided they would march down to Plymouth Rock, get the rock, and take it back to the courthouse as a symbol. However, despite the fact that there were several of them, no one could move the rock, which weighs, I guess, a ton.
Many tons.
And so it stayed where it is.
Yes.
But it's interesting when you look through books like these. You look through Ray Raphael's books. It's interesting to see that the words, and it's on the page, and then when you're talking with the authors, when you're sort of going back over the records they found to write these books, it all comes alive and jumps off the page. I've always thought that the way to teach history is having it told as a story from people who, rather than a dateline. I know that's important too.
Yes.
Anyway,
and in fact, we try to do that on the Tales of Cape Cod website. We have a narrative essay about the events of September 27th. And it is cast in terms of a story. And if anybody wants to see how that works, they're welcome to log into Tales of Cape Cod website and look for the, what's it called, Revolution of 1774 page.
Oh, excellent.
You can read about the whole thing.
Great. That sounds like fun. Are there any events that you're holding to mark this? Or I know you had your big one last year.
We did.
Mm-hmm.
We are hopeful that this will be repeated annually.
The signing of the Declaration of...
A meeting, yes, replicating what had happened in that day in 1774 with a re-signing of the document.
That's exciting.
And we have had interest from a political leader who would like to carry out this plan. So I think it might happen. I think we might see this again next September.
Would be great. And tell me, do you know if this is being taught in the schools? People who go to school down here?
I do not know whether it's being taught in the schools. We have, Tales has made an effort to make sure that they were aware of this having happened right in their own backyard. The third grade is encouraged by the state curriculum guide to learn about its locality
Mm-hmm.
and the history of its locality. It would be the perfect thing to tell the class, right over there, this happened. I don't know whether they picked up on it or not.
Is there anything I haven't asked you about in terms of details, or I was a little disappointed that you didn't show up in the tri-cornered hat today, but it might have been a little bit hot for that. So
I don't even own one, I'm sorry.
Oh, me either. You know, I look through my closet and I own everything else, but no flag shirt and no tri-cornered hat. We'll have to work on that. But tell me, did we... were there other ways besides sharing a drink? And, you know, you told me there was a song, right?
There were, during the marches,
Mm-hmm.
when the marches started in Sandwich and came to Barnstable to the courthouse, they were accompanied by a fife and drum group.
Mm-hmm.
So that they were hearing various songs played along the way. It is very likely that a traditional Revolutionary War song like Yankee Doodle was part of what they heard, maybe even sang along the way. But
then you were telling me that it actually, the song that people sing today is a more modern version, comes from a musical?
Right. It has been modernized since, and people use the lyrics from the musical more than they do the original. Yes.
But the original is still the kernel of the song.
It is.
And
Yes.
the tune is basically the same, right?
Partly.
So maybe one of these days when you visit again, you can explain to me the reference to macaroni.
Well, I'll have to find that out in the meantime.
I never quite understood. Now, let's just do that one little verse. We don't have to sing it. We can say it. But you have to start, because I have the new version in my head.
All right. Yankee Doodle went to town.
Riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Okay, there you go. You guys can sing it at your cookouts, and you can say, hey, we did it first. See you next week.